Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. Web 3.0, often referred to as the decentralized web, represents the next evolutionary stage of the internet. The aim is to create a more equitable and efficient digital ecosystem where users have greater control over their data and digital assets. But what difference is Web 3.0 starting to make today, and what might the implications be for life, society, and business in 10 to 15 years' time? In today's episode, together with founder and creator of Brand Therapy, Jaime Schwarz, we will explore these questions. Jaime, warm welcome to the podcast.
And a warm thank you for having me.
So why don't we start with this? Notwithstanding my introduction, what do we mean by Web 3.0?
Well, you could ask 100 people and you're going to get 100 different answers, I think. The way I do it is by doing the context of Web 1 and Web 2. So in the Web 2 space, we had three major technologies that really pushed us culturally into the Web 2 era, which are broadband, mobile computing, and social media. And because of those three things, we got multimedia digital because of the broadband. We got everything in our pocket, not only to consume, but also to record. And we got social media, which specifically within the commerce space meant that first brave brands, but then every brand had to open up the comment section and have two-way, albeit asynchronous conversations with people. So things like Twitter became the new complaint department / customer service.
Yep.
And so you never know where tech's going to take you, but that's where we've gotten into a centralized walled garden app focused, and I should say apps are a part of Web 2 as well, world that has furthered conspicuous consumerism in a digital space, which has been interesting to see how people define themselves digitally. So Web 3.0, I'm grabbing four different pillars. One is XR, which is just spatial immersive. That can be augmented reality, virtual reality. It doesn't have to be video. It can be, I'm wearing ear pods right now with augmented audio in them, making sure that you don't hear my heater.
Yep.
That's an augmented reality. The next one, of course, being AI, which is all the rage and everybody's talking about. It's a huge enabler and it's the new UX. We're living in the conversational media era. What the hell does that mean? And then, of course, there's blockchain, which most people don't really want to think about in terms of an infrastructure point because you don't need it. And what I mean by that is if we continue down the road of centralized platforms where we really are moving social media from Facebook to Fortnite and those kinds of things, well, we haven't left the centralized platform. And that also means that digital commerce is still not ownership, it's licenseship. And we quote unquote own our products that can't leave those worlds and die as soon as the platform does. So we need blockchain to get back to that open spatial web that was promised with Web 1.0 that we kind of had back then. And then the last one people really aren't talking about in the context of Web 3, which is quantum. And the reason why I put it there is because probably this year, somebody's going to use a quantum computer to break Bitcoin. The second that happens, blockchain doesn't work unless you have quantum proof blockchain.
Yeah.
There's a whole other layer on top of that, of course, like put AI and quantum together. There's the singularity. I have no idea. We'll see what happens. But, just to make sure that the ownership society can keep going on blockchain, we need quantum.
And what's really fascinating to me about some of the things you've been exploring there is this kind of, it's absolutely essential to have the ability to combine some of these technologies to actually create the kind of functionality that we would ideally like, isn't it? And each of these things, they're quite interesting and quite powerful in their own right. When you bring them together, that's when things really start to shift, isn't it?
Oh, indeed. The technical term would be convergence.
Yeah.
And that happens in a lot of different things. It happens with Gen AI in general, where convergence of a lot of different models allowed for you to teach it English and all of a sudden it knew Farsi. How the hell was that possible? Or it learned one kind of math and then it learned another kind of math on its own. Convergence. But when you do that with specific things like immersive and so XR and AI and blockchain, let's get into the NFT space. So right now you hear NFT, you think Bored Apes, you think at best, it's a digital receipt. It's not the JPEG it's pointing to, but it is just a receipt, maybe with a smart contract pointing to one file. In 2017, I filed the world's first NFT patent, which was about a mark of authentication for digital goods, The point being, we need to create more autonomy in the goods. So it's not about the tech, it's about the user experience and the fact that you can own it. How do we make that happen? By creating grouped asset NFTs. So the analogy I like to use is life didn't really get off the ground until single-celled organisms became multicellular organisms. Well, what happens when we have NFTs that specialize and work together? Then we have objects, real world assets that can defend their own authenticity, defend their rights, act on those rights, act on the wishes of the creator and the owners, hold their own social platforms so they can gain the value of likes and comments and follows, not the centralized platforms, and build provenance. So that means that they become the center of the story, kind of like the 1990s movie, The Red Violin. The main
Yeah.
character of that movie was the violin.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? One of the other things that strikes me is some of the things that we're talking about here, and I suppose artificial intelligence, generative AI is the prime example. It reaches a kind of a maturity in the way it hits the lay media, and as soon as something hits the lay media, then you know it's really got momentum. And rarely, I'd argue, have we seen quite such momentum than we see around AI. So when some of these other technologies start to hit the same sort of media in the same sort of way, like blockchain, for example, some of this stuff's really going to motor, isn't it?
You bring up a really good point about adoption. And you go through those early innovators, the early
Mm.
adopters, and then it hits the press, and then we get the other adopters because of what the press says. And that's the product market fit moment that nobody can prepare for
Mm.
because you don't know what the media is going to say that becomes the clickbait that
Yeah,
translates what you actually do into what people think you do. So when you hear all these things right now about DeepSeek, and like that's the thing that's going to take down it. There's so much more detail behind that that people aren't getting into. There's no security for anybody who's working on that free API platform. They just released a visual, I think it's called Janus, to go with their language model that beats DALL-E 3. But why did $600 billion leave NVIDIA and a trillion overall? That's also the timing that all the founders went to go put their money into Project Stargate.
yeah,
So like there's so much that goes into what's actually happening versus what's really happening. And that's just a small, tiny, really niche of this week example,
yeah.
versus everything else that's happening in the tech world. When you introduce a piece of tech into the world, when the press gets a hold of it, you're then at the mercy. You really have to ride the wave of what they've created.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. I mean, it's really, really interesting, and there's a whole kind of different podcast, I think. But once AI becomes the media piece that does get hold of the news, then all of a sudden it's way out of our control. But that's another subject for another podcast.
I'll
Um,
be looking forward to that conversation.
yeah, that's right. Let's talk then a bit about what we're actually seeing emerging now. What are the kind of examples of the difference that Web 3.0 is starting to make? Where can we
Mm.
point to some of these examples?
Sure. So let's talk about digital commerce first of all, because that's already multi-billion dollar industry. When we talk about social media really is now in Fortnite and Roblox and those kind of immersive spaces. We can see it in statistics that say things like Generation Alpha now pays more for their digital clothing than they do for their real clothing. During the NFT boom, Roblox, people were buying these Gucci purses that cost more than the actual thing, but it's just a Gucci purse on your Roblox character. The point here is that we're in the phase right now where it's still centralized licenseship.
Yep.
But if I buy a real Gucci purse, I want the NFC chip in it that is attached to a digital twin that is interoperable across my different metaverses. And I want that purse in real life to be able to grab POAPs the same way as I can grab, experience points or whatever in a digital space. So if I wear something fancy to, I don't know, the Met Gala or something, that totally makes that object worth more because of that provenance. The same way that if I took that purse with me to defeat the evil king in whatever level of something,
Yep.
it's now part of that story as well. And how do you combine those two things? A really good example of that, actually, I was having a conversation a couple of years ago with the CEO of Build-A-Bear. And she was talking about how they had already built a Roblox world. But of course, it wasn't the same as, your physical Build-A-Bear. But I slid this across the table, and your hearers can't hear this, but see this. But this is a button. Looks like a regular button. It's
Yep.
an NFC chip. You can tap this button, and it will link you directly to a secure, whatever it may be. So imagine that button on your physical Build-A-Bear, which not only means that you can have your tea time recorded and your friendship playtime with it put into the bear. But it also means that the provenance of what you do in your Build-A-Bear in Roblox is attached to the same bear. And that means that those values are together. So right now we see a lot of these values building separately,
Yep.
and that convergence of those objects coming together, which has not happened yet. That's one of those convergent points that I'm waiting on. But the values are building right now. And that's a good example.
I mean, the interesting for me about that is that's a really great example of where the kind of real and the virtual worlds are coming together, and that kind of the connection between them is really starting to blur what's real, what's virtual. And now, rather than there just being ideas or emotions, that we're actually able to attach value to this
Mhm.
kind of area as well. That seems to be the big difference.
Well, the funny thing is, and this is why it's so important to be historical when you think about these things, why I use the term provenance. Behind me is a sketch of Albert Einstein when he was on the boat from London to America in 1942. It was sketched by Eugene Spiro. It was handed to my great aunt, who handed it to my grandmother, who handed it to my mother, who handed it to me. That's a very common oral tradition for things that people have hanging in all
Yep.
their homes. But it's not something that the art owns itself. Now it can. So that means that a video of my mom explaining this can now be attached immutably to it. And I can do the same thing when I hand it down to my kids. Now imagine that for all assets. There's a reason why Blackstone said this is going to be a 7 trillion economy in by 2030. That's 5 years. How is that possible?
Yes.
That's how.
I mean, and one of the things that often strikes me whenever we talk about some of these things and the kind of the merger of the digital and the real worlds, if you like, my mind always goes back to Second Life, and that at its
Mm,
peak, it had a $500 million internal economy. And I think
mhm.
I'm always amused by the way that people start to talk now about how the metaverse and how virtual spaces can be places where we can do commerce, where we can do marketing, we can do all sorts of things. And yet, 10 years ago, within this kind of virtual space, there was all this money up to be made. It's almost like it was an idea waiting for the right technology, and we seem to be there now.
I would reverse what you just said.
Oh,
Sometimes
yeah.
we have the right technology waiting for the right idea. Google
Uh-huh.
Glass is another good example there. We
Yep.
seem to, culture is the thing that determines adoption, not the
Yep.
technology. We don't know what to do with it, or we get scared because there's a recorder in the Google Glass,
Yep.
which is in Meta glasses now, and it kills the platform for a decade. And so Second Life was another one of those things where that was exactly the moment that video games started turning on the GPUs and
Yep.
getting graphically really amazing. And that's where the market went. So Second Life got left behind because it had all the things to be a proper ecosystem, and it's still there. And not only is it still there, but one of my partners for my company, Marked, we're built on top of the blockchain called Blockchain Names. It's a name taxonomy. The CEO is Frank Corsi. Frank owns so many hectares of land in Second Life. He's been there for decades. He's friends with the CTO. He has 75 DJs working for him. He farms his own digital marijuana, wraps it in joints, puts it in his own vending machines that people pay for because of the provenance of the growth of that marijuana. He sells art. He's got huge economies. He makes cats, like the Crypto Kitty thing that we remember from
Yep.
like 2017. They're doing that in Second Life. We're enabling that to now get interoperable. So the point that you have, it's another one of these convergence things, little pockets of societies that are all separate and on these centralized platforms. If we can get to that point where we have a primary NFT that owns all these separate provenances as a single entity, we can now finally converge them so they're all one person, regardless of the platform they're on. And when that happens, that's a convergence that all of a sudden doesn't matter what platform you're on, all
Yeah.
of a sudden you're a part of the whole world again.
Yeah, that's the fact. I mean, I think that's really leading us into the third question because we've spoken about the context around Web 1.0, Web 2. We've spoken a bit about there what's happening now and how that perhaps links to things that we've seen happening in the past. So, where might Web 3.0 take us into the future? What might we be talking about in 10, 15 years' time?
So just because the format of this podcast is a 20 minute span, I'm going to jump to the big one.
Yeah.
But it's a jump. So one of the economic factors that happens when you have products that live beyond any one owner is that the mechanism of the invisible hand of the market changes.
Hmm.
So we today are all conspicuous consumers. What that means is that we define ourselves by the brands that we surround ourselves with. We align with their purpose, with our purpose, and look what I'm wearing. This is who I am. That's a part of society today. But when we change the products from the things we consume, we have it, it defines us, we throw it away, it's done, to something that lives beyond us, we get back to a more indigenous kind of thinking, where instead of defining ourselves by the brands we surround ourselves with, we can define ourselves by the legacy we leave behind in the objects that live beyond us. And that is a proper advancement of society, just based on a technological twitch that NFT allows for. But if we can get that invisible hand of that market going, we all become co-creators on an assembly line that never ends. That's a co-creator is a value creator. We all get to make money in the things we buy by adding more value to it, whether that's provenance or social value or utility, going back to the owner. Part of what Mark.art does is it gives me a chance to go back to the owner and say, hey, I own the painting, but I don't own the immersive rights. You still own those. Could I get the immersive rights? Could you make me an immersive version of this? I'll pay you for that. And now I've paid the artist more money that they didn't even know was possible to reach out for. And I've now got a higher utility, multi-modal piece of art that I get to make more off of when I sell it, but also more promotional value while I have it. So those relationships between the original creator or the IP owner and then the successive co-creators creates an intricate web of co-creationism that rewards everybody, not by working separately. Because you look at any industry and every silo, they're all out for their own things. Art collectors, dealers, the artists themselves, they're all out for their own thing. But if the way they make their money is by adding value to the art, then they're all working in a symbiotic relationship to raise the tide of all boats. So you start in art, but that works for everything. And that means that brands get to move into a space just like they had to with social media and Web 2, where they had to be brave enough to turn on the comment section. They have
Yes.
to be brave enough to turn on the co-creation of their products. So they're not just products anymore, they're canvases. And that means we all become Michael Jordan, building our own Air Jordan brands, collabs. And that's another thing. We see collabs around us. Influencers and collabs are becoming co-creators, creators and co-creators. That's part of that evolution that's happening and what I see happening in that direction. So it's a while to get there,
Yep.
but that actually gets us out of late stage capitalism and into early stage co-creationism.
Have you got another kind of example of that around sort of consumer goods,
Hmm.
and how that might work? Because I think art's really interesting, and it might be a relatively small part of the
Hmm.
marketplace, but
Hmm.
taking the Jordan example, what about training shoes? How might a brand do something similar in training shoes, do you think?
Sure. So Nike's a wonderful example. They've been at the forefront of this technology. They bought a company that they've already folded into disappear Artifact. And they've gone through a couple. They filed, my patent was filed in 2017. They filed crypto kicks in 2019. So they've been in this space for a while. They understand that digital goods are a way to go. And they haven't shut down Artifact. They've just moved it into gaming.
Right.
So right now we're watching, just a small side note, we're watching digital ownership, which doesn't have a lot of value in itself because what do I do with the object once I have it? Where's the value? Into
Yeah.
gaming, which is where the provenance is made. And that's where the value is. So it's a smart move. You just have to combine the two. But so with Nike as that example, it was a huge deal. If anybody watched Air, the Amazon Prime movie about the story of how Michael Jordan made it, that was a huge, huge deal that he was allowed to have shared IP in the brand. So sharing IP all the way down to a lower level, let's go into the fashion space. Okay, because there's a lot of brand value in there and very little physical value. You're
Yeah.
paying, for a $5 jumper and, but you're paying $200 for it. So when we're in that space, there's a great example from a guy from 1980s, Dapper Dan, who illegally was taking apart Gucci's and Louis Vuittons and all of these really high fashion and making lifestyle streetwear that was a combo. And it was illegal and he got sued by all those places, but everybody bought from him. And eventually the brands came around and went, yeah, okay. We would be idiots to not let you do what you're doing because you've created something that's a high value for us too. Oh, co-creator. So now we are allowing for the automation of that. And anybody can experiment within the smart contract rules that the brand would allow for. But that means that whatever that product is, the rules of fashion, the rules of the brand value of what you're looking for as a value thing that's way beyond the physical garment now spreads to whatever it could be, soup cans. It really doesn't matter what it is, as long as there's a way to make sure that it is anchored to the chain, which is why the sewing button NFC chip makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
I mean, the thing that struck me then, as you were going through that example, was that we start with consumer goods, but actually you end up in sports, you end up in fashion, as you alluded to, and you end up in entertainment as well. So the applicability of these technologies in the future is just mind blowing in its scope, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is the exception becomes things that remain consumer goods. So you end up with still you'll have consumer goods. I'm going to buy food and eat it and you're done. But then you have prosumer goods, the producer consumers.
Yeah.
And as a prosumer productized good, you have something that you are planning to add value to and sell on. And whenever there's an opportunity for that, the royalties that kick back to the brands, the networks, the social networks that come from a chain of co-creators all working together to build an exquisite corpse of whatever it is, that's a completely different kind of social network and social value to tap into.
Jamie, that's been an extraordinary 20-minute rush through what's clearly a very, very complex and an enormous topic. And I know we've kind of barely touched the surface of this, but your explanations, your examples there, I think were absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for your time.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you everyone for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes of the Informing Choices mini pod. And do let your friends and colleagues know all about the podcast. There'll be another episode along very soon.